The vast plain stretched endlessly, an ocean of golden grass, shifting under the touch of the evening breeze. The sky, painted in hues of crimson and violet, cast long shadows over the land, where danger lurked unseen. A lone covered wagon creaked along the worn path, its wheels groaning beneath the weight of hope and naivety. Inside the wagon, Eliza Winters tightened the shawl around her shoulders, her fingers trembling, though not from the cold. The journey had been long, exhausting, filled with silent meals and distant stares from the man she had once loved. James at the front, reins in hand, his shoulders stiff beneath his worn jacket. He hadn't spoken much in days, not since they had left behind the last outpost of civilization. Something about him had changed on the trail. His laughter had faded, his touch had grown cold, and his once grand dreams of frontier prosperity seemed to weigh on him like a burden rather than a promise. Eliza had married James believing in that dream. A small homestead, land of their own, a fresh start beyond constraints of Eastern society. But as the journey stretched on, hunger and hardship gnawed at them. Their supplies dwindled, their horse limped, and now, miles from the nearest settlement, they were truly alone. Or so she thought. A shadow moved along the ridge. Eliza's heart tightened as she caught sight of dark figures trailing them, their movements ghost-like against the deepening twilight. She swallowed hard. "James," she began, voice low. "I see them," he muttered. She expected him to reach for the rifle resting beside him, to urge the horses faster. Instead, he merely kept them at their steady pace, his grip loosening on the reins. "Should we stop?" she pressed. James hesitated. Then, with a voice that lacked its usual conviction, he said, "No, we wait." Wait? That word sent an uneasy ripple through her chest. She had known James to be a cautious man, but never a passive one. Something was wrong. The night deepened, swallowing the plains in darkness. James guided the wagon toward a narrow gully, where a small cluster of trees offered shelter. He halted the horses and climbed down, dusting off his hands as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. Eliza followed, her boots crunching against dry earth. "James, what's happening?" His jaw tightened, and for the first time, he truly looked at her, not as his wife, but as something else entirely. "Just stay quiet." A flicker of movement in the shadows made her turn. 6 men emerged from the darkness, their faces rough and worn by the elements, their weapons glinting faintly in the moonlight. One of them, a wiry man with a scar tracing his cheekbone, stepped forward with an air of familiarity. "Took you long enough," the man said, voice low and cutting. Eliza's blood turned to ice. James exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "It wasn't easy," he muttered. She started asking questions. Eliza's breath hitched. "James." Her husband's shoulders slumped slightly, though there was no regret in his posture. He didn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, Eliza. I had no choice." Scar grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "Oh, we all got choices, Winters. You just made the smart one." The words didn't make sense. None of it did. Eliza took a step back, her mind scrambling for logic, for some explanation that didn't lead to the horrifying truth unfurling before her. James had led them here. James had brought them to these men. James was giving her to them. Her pulse roared in her ears. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You wouldn't." But he would, and he did. One of the outlaws reached for her. She lashed out, wrenching away, a scream rising in her throat. A rough hand clamped over her mouth, cutting it off. Panic surged through her, hot and blinding. As she struggled against their grip, James turned away. Her heart shattered. She kicked, thrashed, nails clawing at skin, but they were stronger. The night closed in around her as she was dragged from the wagon, her feet skidding against the earth. Then came the war cry. It split the night like a blade, sharp and chilling. The hands gripping her faltered for a fraction of a second too long. An arrow hissed through the darkness, striking one of the outlaws in the throat. Chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked through the silence. Horses shrieked. The men scrambled for cover, their shouts mixing with the sounds of battle. Eliza didn't wait. She tore free, stumbling blindly into the night. She didn't know where she was going. only that she had to run. The world blurred around her, the tall grass slashing against her skin as she sprinted into the unknown. The sound of fighting faded behind her, but she didn't stop, couldn't stop. She had nothing left. No home, no husband, no safety. The betrayal carved itself into her bones, fueling her desperate escape. The land stretched on, indifferent to her suffering. The cold wind howled. The darkness swallowed her whole. By the time she finally collapsed, lungs burning, the sky was thick with stars. Her body ached, her hands raw, her dress torn. She pressed her forehead to the dirt, shivering. Alone, completely, utterly alone. The silence was deafening. But then, somewhere in the distance, a single sound broke through. The rustle of grass, the deliberate footfall of someone who moved with purpose. Not an outlaw, not James. Someone else. Eliza barely had the strength to lift her head as the figure stepped into the moonlight. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, his presence commanding even in the stillness of night. His face remained unreadable, but his dark eyes flickered with something she couldn't name. Recognition, judgment, a test of who she truly was. And then, without a word, he reached into the small pouch at his side, pulled out a piece of dried meat, and tossed it to the ground between them. A choice. Eliza stared at it, her body screaming for nourishment, her mind screaming for caution. Slowly, she reached out. The warrior watched, and the night held its breath. Eliza's fingers trembled as they closed around the dried meat. It was coarse, tough beneath her touch, its scent sharp and foreign. Hunger clawed at her insides, raw and insistent, but she hesitated. The man before her did not move, did not speak. He simply watched. His presence was like the land itself, unshaken, vast, something she could not yet understand. The firelight from his camp flickered over his face, casting deep shadows against the sharp lines of his jaw. His dark eyes held no pity, only patience. A test. She tore a small piece off with her teeth, chewing slowly. The taste was unfamiliar, smoky and gamey, but it filled a hollow ache in her stomach. Only then did the man nod, as if she had passed some silent threshold. The wind shifted, rustling through the endless plains. The night air carried the distant echoes of those who still hunted her, men who would not let their claim go unanswered. Fear prickled down her spine. She glanced at the warrior again, searching for something, anything that might tell her why he had not left her to die. His movements were deliberate as he settled onto the ground across from her, cross-legged and at ease. He had the air of someone accustomed to waiting, to reading the world in its quietest moments. His bow rested within reach, the quiver at his back full. A warrior, clearly, yet he had not killed her, had not taken her prisoner. She swallowed against the dryness in her throat. "Who are you?" Her voice rasped against quiet. A long pause. Then finally he spoke. "Takana." The name carried weight, though it meant nothing to her. She clung to it nonetheless. A name made him real, made this moment real. Eliza shifted her sore limbs, her body aching from flight and betrayal. The fire crackled between them, throwing heat against the cold night. "You saved me," she said, watching him carefully. Takana's gaze didn't waver. No, they were weak. The answer unsettled her. She searched his face for meaning, but his expression remained unreadable. The firelight flickered, stretching the silence. Eliza wrapped her arms around herself. "Why help me?" Another pause. "You ran." It wasn't an answer. Or maybe it was. She exhaled slowly, trying to quiet the whirlwind of emotions inside her. The weight of everything pressed down. James' betrayal, the outlaws, the fact that she had nothing and no one in this world now. But the reality was, whatever Takana's reasons, she was alive because of him. A gust of wind sent the flames dancing higher. She shivered, despite the heat. Takana stood without a word and retrieved something from his horse's saddle, a folded hide. He tossed it to her, and she barely caught it before it could land in the dirt. Warmth seeped through her fingers. She hesitated only for a moment before draping it over her shoulders. She wasn't sure if she should thank him. She wasn't sure if he would care. The night pressing around them. The fire burned low. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its lonely cry carrying across the vast emptiness. Eliza had no choice but to sleep. When she woke, dawn had not yet fully broken, but the world had shifted. Takana was already moving, his hands deftly tying bundles to his horse. Eliza sat up, the hide slipping from her shoulders. "Are you leaving?" He glanced at her, expression impassive. "You cannot stay here." The truth in his words settled deep. She had known it the moment she ran. The outlaws would not stop hunting her. Alone, she would not last another night. A part of her had hoped. Hope for what? She wasn't sure. That she might find shelter? That this stranger might offer her some path forward? But he owed her nothing. She licked her lips, her voice quiet. "Then where do I go?" Takana studied her for a long moment. Then, with the same quiet decisiveness, he turned toward the eastern horizon. "You follow." The choice was hers. She hesitated only a moment before pushing herself to her feet. Her body ached, but she moved anyway. She had no other choice. They traveled in silence. The land was endless, stretching out before them in waves of gold and green. The sun rose behind them, throwing long shadows. Eliza walked because she could not afford to stop. She did not know where he was leading her, only that it was away from death. By midday, exhaustion weighed heavy on her limbs. The hunger from the night before had dulled but not disappeared. She stumbled, but before she could fall, a firm hand caught her arm. Takana steadied her, then let go. She straightened, swallowing the lump in her throat. He continued walking. She followed. The hours passed in measured steps, the rhythm of travel pressing forward like the pull of the earth itself. When they finally stopped, it was by a narrow creek, the water cool and clear. Eliza fell to her knees, cupping handfuls to her mouth, savoring the relief. Takana knelt a few feet away, refilling his water skin. Eliza wiped her lips, glancing at him. "Where are we going?" He took a slow drink before answering. "Where they will not follow." A simple answer, a necessary one. She watched him for a moment longer, noting the way he moved with precision, with ease. There was something both familiar and foreign in it, like watching someone who understood the land in a way she never could. She had been raised on promises of taming the frontier, of carving a home from the wilderness. But here, alone with the wind and the sun and the vastness, she realized how little she truly knew. She lowered her gaze. "I don't even know how to start a fire." Takana did not react. He simply reached into his pouch, pulling out a small flint and striking against steel. Sparks leapt, catching against dry grass. Flames curled upward. Eliza exhaled. "Show me." For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not quite approval, not quite amusement. But he nodded, and he showed her. They camped by the creek as the sun dipped toward the horizon. She watched his movements closely, how he gathered wood, how he checked the wind before setting the flame. When it was her turn, she fumbled, but she tried. Takana said nothing, only watching, waiting. It took several attempts, but eventually the spark caught. She sat back, staring at the small flickering flame, pride swelling in her chest despite the exhaustion weighing her down. She looked up at him. "What now?" Takana met her gaze, his voice quiet but firm. "You learn." The firelight danced between them, casting long shadows against the encroaching night. The wilderness stretched beyond, wild and unyielding. But Eliza was not the same woman who had fled into the darkness. And for the first time, she did not feel entirely alone. The wind carried the scent of rain and blood. Takana's posture had changed the moment the hawk cried out from the ridge. It was subtle, a shift in weight, the tightening of his grip around the worn leather of his bow. But Eliza had learned to recognize it. The way stillness was not the absence of movement, but the preparation for it. Something was coming. She felt it too. A charge in the air, a familiar weight pressing against her chest. A feeling she had known when she first saw the outlaws on the horizon, when James had turned his back to her, when she had fled into the dark with nothing but fear and desperation. But this time, she did not run. Takana lifted his hand, fingers barely twitching, but she understood command, silence. The fire had burned low, barely more than embers now, but the glow could still betray them. She dropped to a crouch, heart pounding. The horse snorted softly, shifting, sensing the tension. A shape moved beyond the tree line. Then another, and another. They had found her. A familiar voice slithered through the darkness, low and cruel. Winters. Eliza's stomach turned. Scar. She hadn't seen his body fall that night. Now she knew why. His voice was closer now, dripping with mockery. We came all this way for you, girl. You didn't think we'd forget, did you? Eliza's hands curled into fists. James had given her to them like she was nothing. A trade, a thing to be bartered, stolen, owned. But she had fought. She had bled. She had survived. She was not theirs to take. A single arrow hissed through the dark, a cry of pain. A body crumpled into the underbrush. Then the world erupted. Gunfire cracked. The sharp snap of arrows cut through the air. The scent of gunpowder, of sweat and iron, filled Eliza's lungs. Takana was a shadow, moving between the trees with deadly precision. His bow barely made a sound, only the whispered breath of arrows finding their mark. Eliza pressed herself against the earth, heart hammering. A figure rushed past her, gun raised. Before she could think, she lunged, arms snapping forward. The blade Takana had given her found flesh. The man's breath hitched, his body convulsing. Her first kill. The knife slipped from her shaking fingers. No time. Another shot rang out. Too close. She turned. Scar stood barely 10 feet away, revolver leveled at her chest. Thought you were dead, she breathed. His lips curled. Not yet. The gun fired. Pain seared through her shoulder, white-hot and blinding. The force sent her staggering back, her vision tilting. The world blurred. Then Scar's body jerked violently. He choked, hands clawing at the arrow buried deep in his throat. He fell without another sound. Takana was there, pulling her upright, his grip firm, steady. His gaze flicked to the wound, then back to her face. You stand. Eliza clenched her teeth against the pain. Blood warmed her skin, soaking through the fabric. But she did not fall. She nodded. He did not waste words. He simply handed her the knife again. The fight was not over. The outlaws were fewer now, but they were desperate. She saw in the wild, frantic where they moved, their confidence shattered, their numbers dwindling. The hunter had become the hunted. One of them ran. Then another. Eliza's breath came ragged as the last of them collapsed, silence rushing in like a tide. It was over. Her legs trembled. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only exhaustion, pain, the weight of it all crashing down. She turned, meeting Takana's gaze. He had blood on his face, on his hands, but his eyes were steady. She had once feared those eyes. Now she found strength in them. Her vision wavered. He caught her before she could fall. The world swayed, and then there was only darkness. When she woke, she was still alive. The morning sun pressed against her eyelids, warm and unrelenting. She stirred, wincing as pain flared through her shoulder. The wound had been bound tightly, the cloth clean. She shifted, taking in her surroundings. The campfire had been rebuilt, its warmth steady. The bodies were gone. Only the land remained, vast and unbothered, as if it had swallowed the violence whole. Takana sat a few feet away, sharpening the edge of his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The rhythm was steady, grounding. She swallowed. How long? His gaze flicked to hers. A night. She exhaled, nodding. She should have been dead. Again. Her fingers traced the bandages at her shoulder. You? A single nod, as if there had been no other choice. Silence stretched between them. Then finally she spoke. I killed a man. He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was even. You lived. A simple truth. A brutal one. She looked down at her hands. She did not feel the horror she had expected, only the weight of it. She had been someone else. Once, a woman who had dreamed of a home, of safety. A woman who had trusted too easily. That woman had died on the plains. She was someone else now. Eliza took a slow breath. Where will you go? Takana considered her for a long moment before responding. West. The words settled into her bones. Familiar. She had once sought the West as a promise, as something waiting to be claimed. Now she knew better. The land could not be claimed. It had always belonged to itself. Eliza watched him. I should go back. He said nothing. She wasn't sure if she was convincing him or herself. But when she pictured the settlements, the walls, the men who decided a woman's fate with the weight of a coin, her stomach turned. She had nothing there, and yet she had something here. The fire cracked softly. The wind whispered across the plains. She met his gaze. I'm going west. A flicker of something crossed his face. He did not question it. He only nodded, as if he had already known, as if he had been waiting for her to say it. The morning stretched before them, open and endless. Eliza pulled the hide tighter around her shoulders. Then, without looking back, she walked toward the horizon. Takana followed,